October night, I was visiting Greenwood Cemetery, one of the oldest in the city of Savannah, Georgia. My grandmother was buried there, and I felt a strange need to talk to her. The place was deserted, and the only lighting came from the yellowed lamps at the gate entrances. The wind ruffled the leaves of the trees, creating a constant whisper that seemed to accompany me. As I walked to her grave, I heard something that made me freeze. A faint, distant voice called my name. At first I thought it was the wind or my mind playing tricks, but then I heard it again, clearer. Ethan, Ethan. It was my grandmother's voice. The problem? She had been dead for 3 years. I hurriedly walked towards his grave, trying to convince myself that it was impossible. But when I arrived, I saw something that took my breath away. There were fresh footprints in the dirt around the tomb, as if someone had just left it. Her name was engraved on the tombstone, but the feeling that she was by my side was almost palpable. Suddenly, my cell phone started vibrating. It was an unknown number. Reluctantly, I answered. On the other end of the line, a familiar, shaky voice whispered, "Ethan, don't forget me." I screamed and dropped the cell phone on the floor. I looked around, but there was no one. I decided to take out my cell phone and check the call history. The number was not registered, and when I tried to call back, the automatic message said the number did not exist. Fear began to take over me, but I still stood before the grave, trying to understand what had just happened. The next day, I decided to share what happened with my mother. She was silent for a moment, then told me something I didn't know. I said that, shortly before she passed away, my grandmother used to mention that she really wanted to tell me something important, but she never got around to it. My mother believed that perhaps my grandmother was still trying to reach me in some way. In the days that followed, I continued to receive calls from that unknown number. Whenever I answered, I would only hear a whisper in the background, as if someone was trying to speak but couldn't. In one of the calls, I clearly heard, "Go back to the cemetery." With fear and curiosity conflicting, I decided to return to Greenwood one last time. I took flowers to my grandmother's grave, and when I arrived, I found something that left me perplexed. There was an old letter, folded carefully, leaning against the tombstone. Upon opening the letter, I immediately recognized my grandmother's handwriting. And it was a simple but profound message: never forget where you came from. Family is eternal. At that moment, I realized that maybe she just needed to make sure her message was heard. The calls have since stopped. But even today, every now and then, I feel the wind whisper my name as I pass by places my grandmother loved. Have you ever received a phone call from someone who has already left? When I was 16, I worked as a temporary caretaker at a small cemetery in a small town in rural Tennessee. It was peaceful work until I started to notice something strange. Some graves didn't look like they had been touched in decades, but others looked fresh, as if they had been recently dug. One night, while patrolling the area, I saw a figure from afar, standing near a grave without a tombstone. I thought it was someone lost, so I approached it. As I got closer, I noticed that the figure was dressed in old clothes, the kind you would only see in old movies. "Are you lost?" I asked, but the person didn't respond. As I got closer, I realized that it had no shadow, even under the moonlight. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, and at that moment, the figure simply disappeared. The next day, I told my supervisor. He laughed and said that the cemetery had a legend. Some people who disappeared in the city were buried there in unmarked graves. No one ever found the bodies, but the spirits, well, those never left. After that, I started to investigate more about the cemetery. I discovered that, in the 1950s, the city had been the scene of several mysterious disappearances. Young people, old people, even children disappeared without a trace. Many families believed there was a link between the disappearances and the cemetery. One day, while I was doing my rounds, I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned around, I again saw the figure that had disappeared before. This time, she approached slowly. The air around me turned cold, and a strong smell of wet earth filled the room. She stood before me and, in a low, grave tone, said, "Not everyone here has been found. Seek the truth." Then it disappeared again. Since then, I've never been able to get that phrase out of my head. Are there still bodies buried there, waiting to be found? Are there secrets hidden beneath the earth that should never be revealed? Do you believe that the missing still roam among us? My name is James, and I grew up in a small town in South Louisiana. My grandmother used to tell stories about the old cemetery that sat on the edge of the swamp. She said that, at night, you could hear sad singing coming from there. A corner that, according to legend, belonged to a woman called Eliza May, who was buried alive after being accused of witchcraft. I never believed these stories until, one night, I decided to defy my fear and visit the cemetery with some friends. It was summer and the night was hot and humid. The air was heavy, and the silence was broken only by the distant sound of frogs and crickets. When we arrived at the cemetery, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The old tombstones were covered in moss and many were cracked. The place seemed abandoned, as if even the living were afraid to approach it. My friends laughed nervously, trying to hide their fear, but I could see that everyone was apprehensive. That's when we heard it. A distant sound, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. It was a melancholic song, a melody that seemed to echo directly from the tombstones. We stopped and we all looked at each other in disbelief. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "It must be the wind," said one of my friends, trying to convince himself. But the chanting continued, getting louder and louder. It was a female voice, full of pain and suffering. We decided to follow the sound, even though each step we took felt heavier than the last. The chant led us to a specific tombstone, partially sunk into the earth. The name engraved on it was Eliza May. Suddenly the singing stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We stood there looking at the tombstone, not knowing what to do. That's when we heard something that chilled our blood. A deep sigh, as if someone had just woken up from a long sleep. "Let's get out of here," one of my friends said, his voice shaking. But before we could move, the earth around the tombstone began to move. It was as if something was trying to get out of there. We ran as fast as we could without looking back. The next morning, I decided to go back to the cemetery alone. I needed to be sure that what we saw was real. When I arrived at Eliza May's headstone, I found something that perplexed me. There was a freshly placed red rose on the grave, and next to it, a small letter that said, "I'm still here." Since that day, the song has never been heard again in the cemetery. But every now and then, people say they see a female figure walking among the tombstones at dusk. Has Eliza May finally found peace? Or does his spirit remain trapped, waiting for someone to hear his last lament? Would you dare to visit the swamp at night? I've been a truck driver for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things on American roads. But no experience was as terrifying as the one I had one winter night on a deserted road in New Mexico. I had been driving for hours, fighting sleep, when I saw a figure on the side of the road. He was a tall man wearing a long black coat. He gave a thumbs up, asking for a ride. Although I rarely stop for strangers, something about him made me slam on the brakes. He got into the truck without saying a word. His face was partially covered by his hat, but I could see that he had a grim expression. I tried to start a conversation, but he just stared out the window as if lost in his own thoughts. After a few minutes of silence, he finally spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I was surprised by the question, but I answered honestly, "I'm not sure. What about you?" He turned his face to me, and for a moment I felt a chill. His eyes were deep and empty, as if he had seen things no man should see. "I'm one of them," he said with a dark smile. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. But when I looked again, he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, as if he had never been there. I stopped the truck on the side of the road, trying to understand what had happened. That's when I saw something that terrified me. In the rearview mirror, the man was standing on the road, looking directly at me. Since that night, I have avoided driving that road. But what scares me most is that every now and then I see that same man in different places, always watching me. Is he caught between this world and the next, looking for someone to take him home? Would you give a stranger a ride on the road? In a small Kansas town, there is a legend that everyone knows. In the local cemetery, there is a tomb that never remains closed. No matter how many times the gravedigger tries to cover the grave, the next day the earth is turned over again. Curious, I decided to investigate. I visited the cemetery at night, armed only with a flashlight. The full moon illuminated the area, casting eerie shadows over the tombstones. When I found the tomb in question, I realized that it was, in fact, open. The earth was scattered around as if something had come out of there. As I watched, I heard a strange sound. It was a scratch coming from inside the grave. My heart raced, but I remained still, trying to understand what was happening. Suddenly, something jumped out of the tomb. It was a skeletal figure, covered in dirt and dressed in ancient clothing. His eyes, or what was left of them, glowed with an unearthly light. "Why did you come back?" the creature asked in a serious tone. Before I could respond, she disappeared, leaving only the smell of damp earth in the air. Since then, I have avoided that cemetery. But the legend lives on. The tomb is said to belong to a man who was buried alive, and his spirit never found rest. Do you believe the dead can return to settle scores?